At the edge of a quiet suburb, in a grand white house that once echoed with laughter, millionaire Alexander Porter sits alone beside the tiny coffin of his newborn son, the child who, along with his wife Clara, was taken from him in a delivery gone tragically wrong. Grief has hollowed him. Everything he built the fortune, the success is meaningless now. But just as he prepares to say goodbye forever, a barefoot boy with dirt-smudged cheeks and haunted eyes appears from the shadows and says 5 impossible words. Your baby is still alive. What Alexander sees next will shake everything he thought he knew, not just about the death he's mourning, but about the truth he was told, and the life he's lived. Why did no one notice the signs? And how did a homeless child know the truth no one else could see? Some truths don't die. They wait to be found. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below to let us know where you're watching this video. The coffin sat in the center of the room, small and impossibly fragile. Its polished mahogany gleamed under the dim light filtering through heavy velvet curtains, but no amount of shine could soften the weight it carried. Alexander Porter stood beside it, his hands trembling as he adjusted the single white rose resting on top. The air smelled faintly of cedar and lilies, a scent that only deepened the ache in his chest. He hadn't slept in days. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara, her smile fading into stillness, her voice silenced forever, and Samuel, tiny, perfect Samuel, who never had a chance to take his first breath. Grief was not new to Alexander. Loss had carved its grooves into him over the years, but this hollowed-out silence was something else entirely. It felt like drowning without water, suffocating without end. The house loomed around him, vast and empty. A mansion built for joy now echoed with absence. Footsteps creaked on distant floors, phantom sounds that might have been memories or just the wind. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, blurring the view of sprawling gardens that Clara had loved so much. She used to say they were their future, a place where laughter would grow alongside roses. Now, the blooms wilted, untended, mirroring everything inside him. Alexander turned away from the coffin, unable to look at it anymore. His fingers brushed against the edge of the table where framed photographs once stood. He'd taken them all down after the funeral arrangements were made. Too painful to see their faces smiling back at him, frozen in happier times. Instead, he focused on practicalities. Signing papers, organizing details, trying to keep moving forward because stopping meant falling apart completely. But then an intrusion, a sound out of place, bare feet slapping against marble, quick and quiet, but unmistakable. Alexander froze, heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called, his voice hoarse from disuse. No answer came, only the faint rustle of movement beyond the doorway. Fury surged, hot and sharp within him. Who dared trespass here in this sacred space of mourning? Clenching his fists, he strode toward the noise, boots echoing loudly in contrast to the intruder's soft steps. Rounding the corner, he stopped short. A boy stood there, no older than 9, barefoot and filthy. Dirt smudged his cheeks and clung to his ragged clothes. Wide, haunted eyes met Alexander's glare. For a moment, neither moved, the tension crackling between them like static electricity. "What are you doing here?" Alexander demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out." The boy didn't flinch. If anything, his expression hardened, resolve flickering behind those 2 old eyes. "Your baby is still alive," he whispered, words slicing through the thick air like a blade. Alexander staggered back as if struck. Alive? Impossible. He'd seen Samuel's lifeless body himself, held him in his arms, while doctors confirmed what he already knew. This child couldn't possibly understand what he was saying. Rage boiled up again, hotter this time. "How dare you?" Alexander spat, advancing on the boy. "Get out of my house." The boy flinched but held his ground, clutching something tightly in his grimy hand. As Alexander reached for him, intending to drag him outside, the boy twisted away and dropped whatever he'd been holding onto the floor. It skittered across the marble, spinning to rest at Alexander's feet. A photograph. For a long moment, Alexander stared at it, uncomprehending. Then, slowly, he bent to pick it up. His breath hitched as recognition dawned. It was Clara, unmistakably her, sitting in a hospital bed, cradling a swaddled infant. But it wasn't Samuel. The baby in her arms was bigger, older. Dark hair peeking out from beneath the blanket, eyes open and alert. Impossible. This wasn't real. Yet the image burned itself into his mind, refusing to be dismissed. When Alexander looked up again, the boy was gone, vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. Only the echo of his footsteps remained, fading into silence. Alexander sank to his knees, the photograph trembling in his grip. Questions swirled chaotically in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Who was the boy? Where had he come from? And most terrifying of all, who was the baby in the picture? Grief gave way to something sharper, colder. Hope, perhaps, or desperation. Either way, it gnawed at him, relentless and insistent. Whatever peace he'd hoped to find in burying Samuel now seemed impossibly far away, because if the boy was telling the truth... Clara's face swam before him, pale and peaceful in death. Had she known something he didn't? Kept a secret even in her final moments? Alexander clenched the photograph tighter, knuckles white. The pieces didn't fit, but they couldn't be ignored. Not anymore. Somewhere outside, thunder rumbled, breaking the oppressive quiet. Rain began to fall harder, pelting the windows like tears from heaven, but Alexander barely noticed. His world had shifted, tilting precariously on an axis he couldn't yet comprehend. Alive. The word reverberated in his skull, both promise and curse. Somewhere, somehow, answers waited. And Alexander would tear apart the earth to find them. The photograph lay on the desk in front of him, illuminated by the cold glow of a banker's lamp. Alexander leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the polished mahogany surface, his gaze fixed so intently that it felt like he might burn through the image itself. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up again, turning it over in search of answers. There was no mistaking Clara's face, her soft smile, the faint dimple in her left cheek when she wasn't trying to hide it. But something about her was different. Her hair was longer than he remembered from those last days, framing her face in loose waves instead of the neat bun she'd worn in the hospital. And then there was the baby, a squirming bundle cradled against her chest. Not Samuel. This child had dark tufts of hair peeking out from beneath the blanket, and its eyes were open, wide and alert, staring directly at the camera. Alexander's stomach churned. He flipped the photo over. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, were two things, a date and a name. March 14th. Baby James. His breath caught. March 14th? That couldn't be right. Clara had died on March 2nd, just hours after giving birth to Samuel. The doctors had confirmed it. A ruptured artery during delivery, sudden and catastrophic. They'd barely managed to save Samuel before losing her entirely. Or so they said. But this photograph suggested otherwise. If Clara had been alive on March 14th, what did that mean? Had she somehow survived? And who was baby James? He stared at the infant again, searching for any resemblance to Samuel or himself, but found none. Then his focus shifted to one small detail, a crescent-shaped birthmark near the baby's ear. It was unmistakable, unique. Alexander exhaled sharply. Samuel had no such mark. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he let himself imagine. It wasn't impossible, was it? What if Clara hadn't died? What if someone had lied to him? But why? Who would do such a thing? The questions swirled faster, tightening around his throat until he could barely breathe. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone and dialed the hospital where Clara had given birth. After several rings, a nurse answered, her voice calm and professional. "Hi," Alexander began, struggling to keep his tone steady. "I need some information about my wife's records. Clara Porter. She passed away in your maternity ward earlier this month." There was a pause on the other end. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Porter," the nurse replied gently. "Let me pull up her file." Alexander waited, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the nurse spoke again. "According to our records, Mrs. Porter never left the maternity ward. She passed shortly after delivering her son, as you know." His grip tightened on the phone. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain?" "Yes, sir," she said firmly. "We have strict protocols for these situations. There's no record of her being discharged or leaving the facility under any circumstances." Alexander swallowed hard, bile rising in his throat. "Thank you," he muttered, hanging up before she could ask anything further. He sat there, staring at the wall, his mind racing. If Clara hadn't left the hospital, and yet here was proof that she'd been alive 2 weeks later, then what had happened to her body? To her funeral? Images flashed through his mind. The casket closed tightly, sealed shut because it was best. He remembered arguing with the funeral director about seeing her one last time, only to relent when they insisted it would bring him no peace. Had they lied to him? Staged her death? The thought made his skin crawl. Who profits from such deception? Money, perhaps? Revenge? Or something darker still? Alexander stood abruptly, pacing the length of the study. The room felt suffocating, its high ceilings doing nothing to ease the pressure building inside him. He needed fresh air, but even more, he needed clarity. He grabbed the photograph and headed outside, stepping onto the rain-slicked terrace. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, heavy quiet. As he looked out over the gardens, his thoughts turned inward. Clara had always been strong-willed, fiercely independent. She wouldn't have gone quietly into the night, not without a fight. If she'd truly survived, if someone had taken her, then where was she now? And who was baby James? The questions gnawed at him, relentless and unyielding. For the first time in weeks, grief wasn't the only emotion driving him. Anger simmered beneath the surface, mingling with desperation and a flicker of hope so fragile it might shatter at the slightest touch. Alexander glanced down at the photograph once more, tracing the curve of Clara's smile with his thumb. "Where are you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "What happened to you?" Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out, its lonely call echoing across the estate. Alexander clenched his jaw, resolve hardening within him. Whoever had done this, to Clara, to Samuel, to him, they would pay. No matter how long it took, no matter how deep he had to dig, he would uncover the truth. Because the alternative, that Clara was truly gone forever, was unthinkable. The handwriting on the back of the photograph was small, cramped, and slanted as though written hastily. Alexander turned it over again. his eyes narrowing on the cryptic message scrawled in the corner. For J.R. She'll be safer this way. J.R. Who was J.R.? The initials meant nothing to him, but they gnawed at the edges of his mind like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. Safer from what? And why would Clara involve someone else without telling him? He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands. His gaze drifted to the bookshelves lining the walls, rows upon rows of legal texts, biographies, and photo albums chronicling happier times. One section stood out. A collection of boxes labeled simply Clara's Things. He'd avoided them since her death, unwilling to face the memories locked inside. But now, something compelled him forward. Alexander rose and pulled down the first box, brushing off a thin layer of dust. Inside were mementos from their life together. Ticket stubs, dried flowers pressed between pages of poetry books, letters tied with ribbon. As he sifted through the contents, one envelope caught his eye. It was plain, unassuming, but the return address made his heart skip. A hospital logo stamped neatly in the corner. With trembling fingers he opened it. Inside was a letter, dated weeks before Clara's death. Dear Clara, I hope you're doing well. I know how hard these past months have been for you, but please trust me when I say we're doing everything we can to keep things under control. Dr. Hargrove has agreed not to press charges regarding the incident last month, but you need to be careful moving forward. If anyone finds out about, well, you understand the risks. Please let me know if you still want to proceed with the plan. I'll do whatever I can to help, but time is running short. Take care, Janice Rowley. Alexander's breath hitched. Janice Rowley. J.R. Could it really be the same person? He scanned the signature again, matching the initials to the ones on the photograph. It fit. But what plan? What risks? The more he read, the more questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. Clara had never mentioned any trouble at the hospital, or anything involving someone named Janice Rowley. Yet here was proof that she'd been corresponding secretly with this woman, planning something significant enough to warrant caution. His mind raced. Was this connected to baby James? Had Clara tried to protect the child from some unseen threat? And if so, why hadn't she told him? Did she think he wouldn't understand? Or worse, did she fear he might stop her? Alexander rifled through the rest of the box, searching for more clues. Another envelope surfaced, this one smaller and postmarked just days before Clara's supposed death. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. Clara, I've done what you asked. Everything is ready. Remember, once it's done, there's no going back. You'll have to disappear completely. Please, don't make me regret helping you. For both your sakes, stay safe. J.R. Disappear. The word hit him like a punch to the gut. Disappear? Clara would never leave him willingly, not unless she believed it was the only way to protect someone she loved. Someone like baby James. A chill crept up his spine as pieces began falling into place. The closed casket. The lack of records at the hospital. The strange boy who claimed Samuel was alive. None of it added up unless Clara had orchestrated her own disappearance. But why? And where had she gone? More importantly, who had helped her? And why would they risk everything to fake her death? Alexander leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as a headache bloomed behind his eyes. This wasn't just grief talking anymore. This was betrayal, confusion, a desperate longing for answers. Clara had kept secrets from him, big ones, and now those secrets were unraveling his world thread by thread. He picked up the photograph again, staring at Clara's serene expression. Her smile seemed almost knowing now, as if she'd left this trail intentionally, trusting that he'd follow it when the time came, trusting him to find her. And maybe baby James, too. For the first time since her death, Alexander felt a spark of purpose ignite within him. Whoever Janice Rowley was, wherever she was now, she held the key to unlocking the truth. He needed to find her. Because if Clara was alive, if she'd sacrificed everything to protect their family, then he owed it to her to bring her home. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain-soaked leaves. Alexander stood by the window in his study, a glass of whiskey dangling loosely from his fingers. He hadn't touched it. Instead, he stared out into the darkness, where shadows shifted among the overgrown hedges of the garden. Something, or someone, was out there. At first, he thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him again. Grief did that, didn't it? Made you see ghosts in every flicker of movement, hear whispers in the wind. But then he saw it. A small figure darting between the trees, quick and silent like an animal. The boy. Micah. Alexander's jaw tightened. Part of him wanted to march outside and confront the child, demand answers about the photograph, the cryptic words, everything. But another part, the part that had spent years mastering patience, urged him to wait, to watch. So he stayed rooted to the spot, sipping his untouched drink as if nothing unusual were happening. Minutes passed before the boy finally emerged from the shadows, creeping closer to the house. His bare feet padded softly against the wet grass, leaving faint impressions that would vanish with the morning sun. Alexander exhaled sharply and set the glass down, moving toward the door. When he stepped outside, Micah froze, caught mid-motion as he reached for something on the porch, a half-eaten loaf of bread left behind by the staff earlier that day. For a moment, neither of them moved. The boy's wide eyes locked onto Alexander's, wary but unafraid. "You," Alexander said, his voice low and deliberate. "What are you doing here?" Micah straightened slowly, clutching the bread to his chest. Dirt still smudged his cheeks, and his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was a sharpness to him, a quiet intelligence that belied his age. "I came back," he said simply, as though stating the obvious. "Why?" Alexander pressed, taking a step forward. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." Micah glanced at the ground, then back up at Alexander. There was no apology in his gaze, only defiance. "But I'm hungry." Alexander hesitated. This wasn't what he'd expected. Not outright honesty, not vulnerability. The boy looked so young, so fragile, standing there in the dim light of the porch lantern. Against his better judgment, Alexander softened slightly. "Come inside," he said after a pause. "You can eat properly." Micah eyed him suspiciously, but followed without argument, slipping past him into the warm glow of the house. Alexander led him to the kitchen, where he pulled together a plate of food, leftover chicken, slices of cheese, fruit, and more bread. Micah devoured it hungrily, perched awkwardly on one of the high-backed stools at the counter. As the boy ate, Alexander leaned against the opposite counter, arms crossed, studying him. "Tell me," he began, his tone measured. "How do you know about Clara?" Micah paused mid-bite, lowering the piece of apple he held. "She used to sing to me," he said quietly, almost reverently. "The lady with the music." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. Clara had played the violin since she was a girl, filling their home with melodies that seemed to echo her soul. She often sang while she played, her voice soft and lilting, weaving stories through song. No one else knew about that, not even close friends or family. It was their private thing, a shared intimacy that belonged only to them. "How did you hear her sing?" Alexander asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Micah shrugged, chewing slowly now. "In the White Room. She let me stay there sometimes when it rained. Said I could listen to her play." "The White Room," Alexander repeated, his mind racing. Of course, the music room. Clara had always called it the White Room because of its pale walls and gauzy curtains. It was her sanctuary, a place she rarely allowed others to enter. Yet this boy claimed to have been there, to have sat with her while she played. "Where's she now?" Alexander demanded, his voice rising despite himself. "Is she alive? Did she send you here?" Micah flinched at the sudden intensity but held his ground. "I don't know where she is," he admitted. "But she told me. She told me to take care of baby James if anything happened to her." The name hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. Baby James, again. "What do you mean, if anything happened?" he pressed, leaning closer. "Did she tell you what might happen?" Micah shook his head, his expression darkening. "She just said some people wouldn't understand, that they'd try to hurt us if they found out." "Us?" Alexander echoed, his pulse quickening. "Who's us?" The boy hesitated, glancing away. For a moment, Alexander thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, Micah whispered, "Her and me. And baby James." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Alexander sank into a chair, his thoughts spinning wildly. If Clara had confided in this boy, if she'd trusted him enough to share her fears and secrets, then, perhaps, she really was alive somewhere, hiding. Or worse, perhaps she was already gone, entrusting her son to a child who barely understood the weight of the responsibility. And yet, how could Micah possibly know these things? How could he describe the White Room so vividly, recall Clara's singing with such clarity, unless Clara had been watching over him somehow from afar, protecting him? Alexander looked at Micah again, really looked at him. The dirt-streaked face, the haunted eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for another slice of apple. Whatever role this boy played in the mystery, it was clear he wasn't lying. Not entirely. "Do you know where baby James is now?" Alexander asked finally, his voice softer. Micah nodded, swallowing hard. "He's safe, for now, but we have to keep him hidden. They're still looking for him." "Who's looking for him?" Alexander pressed, his heart pounding. Micah met his gaze, fear and determination warring in his expression. "The same people who took Clara." Alexander felt the floor tilt beneath him, the pieces clicking into place too fast, too painfully. Clara hadn't disappeared willingly, not completely. Someone had forced her hand, driven her into hiding. And now, those same people were after her child. "Help me find him," Micah pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please. She trusted you." For a long moment, Alexander didn't respond. He sat there, staring at the boy, grappling with the enormity of what he was being asked to do, to believe, to risk. Finally, he nodded once, firmly. "I'll help you," he said, "but you have to tell me everything." Micah relaxed visibly, relief washing over his features. "Okay," he whispered, "I'll tell you everything." And for the first time since Clara's death, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. A fragile, trembling thing, but hope nonetheless. Somewhere, out there, answers waited. And maybe, just maybe, Clara was waiting too. The hospital loomed before him, its sterile facade a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside Alexander. He'd spent hours poring over records, piecing together fragments about Janice Rowley, the nurse who might hold the key to Clara's disappearance, and baby James's survival. What he found chilled him to the bone. Janice Rowley had worked in the maternity ward for nearly 2 decades, known for her compassion and dedication. But 8 months prior, she'd been fired under mysterious circumstances, just weeks after Clara's supposed death. The official reason cited protocol violations, though details were sparse. Then, 3 months later, her life ended tragically in a house fire that consumed her small suburban home. Or so the records claimed. Alexander stood in the dimly lit hallway of the hospital's administrative wing, clutching a folder filled with photocopies of personnel files. Most pages were incomplete, entire sections redacted with thick black lines, a deliberate erasure of history. Among them was a single surviving document, an obituary clipped from a local newspaper. It mentioned no family, no survivors. Just a brief note about her untimely passing and a memorial service attended by colleagues. But something didn't add up. Nurses like Janice didn't vanish without a trace unless someone wanted them gone. And fires didn't conveniently destroy evidence unless they were meant to. Determined to dig deeper, Alexander tracked down Janice's estranged brother, a man named Carl Rowley, who lived on the outskirts of town in a dilapidated trailer surrounded by rusted cars and overgrown weeds. When Alexander knocked on the door, Carl greeted him with suspicion, his weathered face hardening as soon as Alexander mentioned his sister's name. "I haven't talked about Jan in years," Carl grumbled, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you want?" Alexander hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think your sister knew my wife, Clara Porter. She passed away recently, and I'm trying to understand what happened." Carl's expression shifted, flickering with something unreadable, regret, perhaps, or guilt. After a long pause, he stepped aside, motioning for Alexander to enter. Inside, the air smelled of stale cigarettes and mildew. Papers and tools cluttered every surface, but there was one item set apart, a charred leather-bound diary resting on a makeshift shelf. "That's all I got left of her," Carl said, nodding toward the diary. "Found it in the ashes after the fire. Figured it was important even if I couldn't make heads or tails of most of it." Alexander's pulse quickened as he reached for the diary, handling it gingerly. Its cover was cracked and brittle, the edges scorched black. Some pages had fused together while others crumbled at the slightest touch. Still, enough remained legible to hint at secrets buried within. He flipped through cautiously, scanning entries written in hurried, uneven handwriting. Many were mundane notes about shifts and patients, but one passage stopped him cold. March 3rd. The baby's heart stopped, but not the other one. They don't know. Can't let them find out. Too dangerous. Forgive me, Clara, for what I've done. Alexander's breath hitched. March 3rd, the day after Samuel's birth. His mind raced, connecting dots that refused to form a coherent picture. If Samuel's heart had stopped, then who was the other one? Baby James. Was that why Clara had hidden him? To protect him. "What does this mean?" Carl asked, peering over Alexander's shoulder. His voice carried a mix of curiosity and unease. "I don't know yet," Alexander admitted, though the truth clawed at the edges of his thoughts. Someone had lied, not just to him, but to everyone. Clara hadn't died alone in that hospital room. Something far more sinister had unfolded, and Janice Rowley had been caught in the middle of it. Carl sighed heavily, sinking into a sagging armchair. Jan always did have a soft spot for people in trouble. Said she couldn't turn her back when someone needed help. Guess that's what got her killed in the end. "Killed?" Alexander repeated sharply, turning to face him. You think the fire wasn't an accident? Carl shrugged, avoiding eye contact. All I know is, she started acting strange around the time she lost her job. Kept talking about keeping them safe and making things right. Wouldn't tell me who them was, but she looked scared, like she was running out of time. Alexander clenched the diary tightly, his knuckles white. Whoever them referred to, it likely included Clara and baby James, and if Janice had tried to protect them, her efforts had cost her everything. Did she leave anything else behind? Alexander asked, his voice strained. Anything that might point me in the right direction? Carl shook his head. Just that diary. Like I said, I kept it because it felt significant. But if you're looking for answers, you're gonna have to figure it out yourself. As Alexander left the trailer, the weight of the diary pressed against his chest like a leaden anchor. Night had fallen, and the world outside seemed darker, heavier. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, fragmented, but they pointed toward a single, undeniable truth. Clara hadn't disappeared on her own. Someone had forced her hand, driven her into hiding, or worse. And now, those same forces were hunting baby James. Back in his car, Alexander opened the diary again, rereading the haunting entry. Forgive me, Clara. The words echoed in his mind, taunting him with their ambiguity. Who should forgive her? Him? Herself? Or someone else entirely? One thing was certain. Janice Rowley had sacrificed herself to keep a secret. A secret that now rested squarely on Alexander's shoulders. He started the engine, gripping the steering wheel until his fingers ached. Somewhere, somehow, Clara's trail waited to be uncovered, and wherever it led, he would follow. For her, for Samuel, for baby James, for the truth. The drive to Dr. Evelyn Hargrove's home was long and winding, taking Alexander through mist-shrouded hills that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Each mile brought him closer to answers, but also deeper into a labyrinth of questions he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Dr. Hargrove lived in a modest cottage at the edge of a quiet lake, its windows reflecting the pale morning light. She opened the door herself, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her glasses. Time had etched lines into her face, but her eyes still carried the sharp intelligence and weary compassion of someone who'd spent decades navigating life and death decisions. "Mr. Porter," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Her voice carried an undercurrent of sorrow, as though she'd been expecting this visit for years. "Please, come in." Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Photos lined the walls. Snapshots of smiling families, newborns, cradled in loving arms. It struck Alexander how many lives she must have touched over the years, yet none of those smiles belonged to Clara, or Samuel, or baby James. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of unspoken truths hung heavy between them, palpable and suffocating. "You knew my wife," Alexander began finally, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Clara." Dr. Hargrove nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. "Yes, I remember her vividly. Such a kind soul, so full of hope." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she reached for a glass of water to steady herself. "I wish I could say I brought her joy instead of pain." Alexander leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Tell me what happened that day, everything you remember." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. Then, with a deep breath, she began. "It was a complicated pregnancy from the start," she explained. Clara developed preeclampsia early on, which made delivery risky. We monitored her closely, did everything we could to ensure both mother and child would survive. But her voice trailed off, and she looked away, guilt shadowing her features. But what? Alexander pressed gently, though every nerve in his body screamed for her to continue. There were complications during labor, she admitted, her tone heavy with regret. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously high, and there was significant bleeding. By the time we delivered the first baby, a boy, the damage was already done. His heart stopped shortly after birth. We tried resuscitation, but she shook her head, unable to finish. Alexander swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. This part of the story matched what he'd been told. Samuel had died during childbirth. But then why did Janice Rowley's diary mention 2 babies? Why had Micah spoken of baby James? And the second heartbeat? He asked quietly, his heart pounding in anticipation. Dr. Hargrove froze, her eyes widening slightly. How do you know about that? Just tell me, he urged, leaning closer. Please. She sighed deeply, rubbing her temples as if trying to ward off a headache. It's not something I'm proud of, Mr. Porter. During the chaos of the delivery, we detected another heartbeat. A second baby. Twins. But the second heartbeat faded almost immediately. One moment it was there, faint but present, and the next, gone. We assumed it had been too weak to sustain itself. But you weren't certain, Alexander guessed, his voice growing sharper. You didn't see the body. No, she admitted, reluctantly. We never found one. There was so much blood, so much confusion. When Clara coded shortly afterward, our focus shifted entirely to saving her. And when we couldn't, her voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. When we lost her too, the hospital insisted on simplifying the report. They said recording a single stillbirth would avoid legal complications. Easier for everyone involved. Easier. The word made Alexander's stomach churn. Easier for whom? Certainly not for him, not for Clara, not for the child who might still be out there. So you lied, he said flatly, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. I omitted the truth, she corrected, meeting his gaze with a mixture of defiance and shame. At the time, I thought it was the right thing to do. Clara was gone, and the hospital board pressured me to keep things simple. No one wanted to deal with the mess of a missing infant, least of all me. But what if the baby survived? Alexander demanded, his voice rising. What if someone took him, covered it up? Dr. Hargrove flinched, clearly taken aback by the suggestion. I don't know, she whispered, shaking her head. I can't imagine anyone going to such lengths, but if they did... She trailed off, her expression darkening. Then, whoever it was, they're dangerous. Very dangerous. Alexander sat back, reeling from the implications. If Clara hadn't died alone, if someone had taken baby James while she fought for her life, then the conspiracy ran deeper than he dared to consider. Who would orchestrate such a deception? And why? He glanced at the photos on the wall again, searching for some semblance of comfort in the faces of strangers. Instead, all he saw were reminders of what he'd lost, and what might still be waiting to be found. Thank you, he said finally, standing abruptly. His legs felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. For telling me the truth. Dr. Hargrove rose as well, her expression pained. I'm sorry, Mr. Porter, truly. I wish I could undo what happened. If there's anything else I can do. He nodded curtly, unable to trust himself to speak further. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air hit him like a slap, grounding him momentarily. The pieces were coming together now, forming a picture that was both horrifying and heartbreaking. Twins. 2 heartbeats. One reported dead, the other vanished without a trace. Clara had known. That much was clear, which meant she'd risked everything to protect baby James. And now, Alexander owed it to her to find him. Whatever it took. The room was silent except for the faint creak of wood as Alexander knelt on the floor, surrounded by Clara's belongings. He'd spent hours combing through the boxes again, searching for anything he might have missed. A note, a letter, some scrap of evidence that could lead him closer to baby James. And then, tucked beneath a false bottom in an antique writing desk, he found it. A birth certificate, folded carefully and placed inside a small envelope. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the details. Name, Ella Grace Porter. Date of birth, March 2nd, mother, Clara Marie Porter, father, Alexander Reed. Porter, Ella, not James, a girl. The same date as Samuel's recorded death, but with a different name entirely. His breath hitched, the paper crinkling slightly under his tightening grip. How had this been hidden so well? Who else knew about her? Before he could process the full weight of what he was holding, a soft voice broke the silence behind him. That was my sister. Alexander turned sharply, startled. Micah stood in the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face pale but resolute. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes. Recognition, grief, and something else. Something older than his years. Your sister? Alexander repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? Micah stepped closer, hesitating before kneeling beside him. His gaze dropped to the birth certificate in Alexander's hands, lingering on the name Ella Grace. For a moment he said nothing, his jaw working as if trying to find the right words. She wasn't always called Ella, Micah said finally, his voice low and uneven. When I first met her, they called her Baby James. But later, when we were safe, at least for a while, they gave her a new name. Said it would help keep her hidden. Alexander stared at him, his mind racing. Who gave her the name? Who was keeping her safe? Micah shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. I don't know all the names, just hers, and yours. He pointed at the birth certificate. That's why I came back. To make sure you knew about her. But how do you know her? Alexander pressed, his tone sharper now. How does a boy like you end up connected to my daughter? Micah flinched at the word daughter, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he took a shaky breath, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk. Because she saved me, he admitted quietly. Before they could take her, she saved me. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him, the pieces falling into place too fast to fully grasp. Take her? Take her where? To them, Micah replied cryptically, his voice trembling. The people who wanted her gone. The ones Janice tried to protect us from. His words hit like a punch to the gut. Janice Rowley, the nurse whose life had ended in flames. The woman who'd written in her diary about protecting them. Suddenly, the connection clicked. Clara hadn't just hidden baby James, or Ella. She'd entrusted her safety to someone else. Someone unexpected. You, Alexander whispered, realization dawning. She left her with you. Micah nodded slowly, tears brimming in his wide haunted eyes. For a little while, until I could get her somewhere safer. But I couldn't stay. They were looking for me, too. Who is they? Alexander demanded, his voice rising despite himself. Who are these people? I don't know, Micah shot back, his composure breaking as anger and fear bubbled to the surface. They never showed their faces, just shadows, voices in the dark. All I know is They're bad, really bad, and they won't stop until they find her. Alexander leaned back, his head spinning. This boy, this scared, scrappy child, had been part of Clara's plan all along. Somehow, she trusted him to protect Ella, to keep her alive when everyone else thought she was dead. He looked down at the birth certificate again. The name Ella Grace staring back at him. His daughter. Alive. Hidden. Hunted. And now, thanks to Micah, she was one step closer to being found. Where is she now? Alexander asked, his voice softer but no less urgent. Do you know where they took her? Micah hesitated, biting his lip. There's a place. Far away. Somewhere she'll be safe, but it's not easy to get to, and if we go, they'll follow. Alexander reached out, placing a steadying hand on Micah's shoulder. Then we'll make sure they don't catch us. Whatever it takes, we'll bring her home. Micah met his gaze, searching for something. Trust, perhaps, or reassurance. Finally, he nodded once, determination hardening his features. Okay, he said. But you need to promise me one thing. What? No matter what happens, Micah whispered, his voice breaking. You can't let them take her again. Alexander swallowed hard, the weight of the promise settling heavily on his shoulders. I swear it, he said firmly. On my life. For the first time since meeting Micah, the boy allowed himself a flicker of hope. It was fragile, fleeting, but real. Together they would unravel the rest of the mystery. Together they would find Ella Grace. And together they would confront whoever had tried to erase her from existence. The room was dimly lit, the late afternoon sun filtering weakly through heavy curtains. Alexander sat across from Micah at the kitchen table, the birth certificate lying between them like a fragile artifact. The boy's hands fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve, his gaze darting toward the window as if expecting someone or something to appear. You don't know where she is now, Alexander repeated slowly, trying to keep his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Ella. Micah shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. No, he admitted quietly. I lost her. A long time ago. Alexander leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. The frustration and desperation clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. For Micah's sake. Whatever secrets the boy carried, they weren't going to come easily. He needed patience and trust. Tell me everything, Alexander said finally, his tone gentle but firm. From the beginning. Micah hesitated, glancing down at his lap before meeting Alexander's gaze. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a rawness that made it clear how much this confession cost him. But he nodded, taking a deep breath. I don't remember much about when I was little, he began, his voice soft and halting. Just bits and pieces, flashes, like being warm, safe, someone singing to me. That's how I know about Clara. Her voice. It's in my dreams sometimes, even though I never met her. Alexander's heart tightened. Micah's words painted a picture of a bond forged in fragments, a connection neither fully understood nor remembered. Yet, here they were, bound together by Clara's choices and sacrifices. What else do you remember? Alexander prompted gently. Micah reached for the bag slung over the back of his chair, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. It was worn and faded, creased from years of folding and unfolding. Carefully, he smoothed it out on the table. The drawing depicted a simple house, a white house, its windows glowing warmly like lanterns against a dark background. In the foreground stood two figures, a woman holding a violin and a child clutching her hand. This, Micah said, tapping the paper. It's been with me forever, ever since I can remember. They told me at the group home it came in the bag I arrived in, along with a note. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another scrap of paper, yellowed with age. On it, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were 3 short sentences. Protect him. She's not safe yet. Find the White House. Alexander stared at the note, his pulse quickening. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure Micah survived, and that he found his way here. To Clara. The White House, he murmured, looking up at Micah. You think it's this place? Micah nodded, his expression earnest. I dreamed about it too, not just in pictures but in feelings, like it was somewhere important, somewhere I belonged. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. And then I saw her, Clara, in my dreams, playing her violin, singing to me. I thought, maybe she could tell me where Ella is. Tears welled in Micah's eyes, spilling silently down his cheeks. He wiped them away quickly, embarrassed, but didn't look away. I ran away from the group home because I thought if I found this place I'd find answers. About Ella. About why I'm connected to her. About why... His voice broke, and he swallowed hard. Why people kept telling me I wasn't safe. Alexander felt the weight of the boy's pain settle heavily around them. This wasn't just about finding Ella. It was about understanding who Micah was and what role fate had assigned him in Clara's plan. Do you have any idea who left you at the group home? Alexander asked after a moment, his voice careful. Or who wrote the note? Micah shook his head again, frustration flashing across his face. No one ever told me anything, just that I showed up one day with the bag and the note. Nobody knew who brought me or why, but... He hesitated, chewing on his lip. Sometimes I wonder if it was Clara, if she hid me too. The thought sent a chill through Alexander. Clara, hiding Micah? Protecting him alongside Ella? It seemed impossible, and yet, somehow, it fit. Clara had always been fiercely protective, willing to risk everything for those she loved. If she'd entrusted Ella to Micah, even unknowingly, it wouldn't be out of character. But why? Why separate them? Why leave such cryptic clues? And you haven't seen Ella since... When? Alexander pressed, steering the conversation back to the present. Micah shrugged helplessly. A few years ago, maybe longer. I don't even know if she remembers me. All I know is we were running. Always running. Until one day I woke up and she was gone. Just vanished, like Clara. Alexander let the silence stretch between them, absorbing the enormity of Micah's story. This boy had carried the burden of survival alone, guided only by fragments of memory and a vague sense of purpose. And now, here he was, sitting across from Alexander, hoping desperately for answers neither of them fully understood. Listen to me, Alexander said firmly, leaning forward to catch Micah's gaze. We'll figure this out. Together. You're not alone anymore. For a moment, Micah simply stared at him, searching for reassurance in Alexander's face. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he whispered. Together. As dusk settled outside, casting long shadows across the room, Alexander realized something profound. Micah wasn't just a clue in the mystery, he was part of it. Part of Clara's plan, part of Ella's story, and perhaps part of their future. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Or Clara. Or Ella. The attic was a cavern of forgotten things, its air thick with the dust and the faint scent of cedar. Alexander climbed the narrow staircase slowly, each creak of the old wood echoing like a ghostly whisper. He hadn't been up here in years, not since Clara's death, and the weight of memories pressed down on him as he pushed open the heavy door. It was dark, save for the pale light filtering through a small dusty window at the far end of the room. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, their contents spilling out in places. Photo albums, holiday decorations, clothes long outgrown. But it wasn't the clutter that drew his attention. It was the figure in the window. For a moment, his breath caught. There she was, Clara, or so it seemed. Her silhouette stood framed by the dim light, her hair falling softly around her shoulders, her hand resting against the glass as if reaching out to him. Then reality snapped back into focus. It wasn't Clara. It was a mannequin, draped in an old dress, its face obscured by shadows. Alexander exhaled sharply, shaking off the illusion. Grief played tricks, he reminded himself. Yet something about the scene lingered, a sense of purpose, as though Clara herself had guided him here. He moved deeper into the attic, brushing cobwebs aside as he searched. The neighbor's story had haunted him ever since Micah mentioned the White House. Mrs. Hensley, who lived 2 properties down, had sworn she'd seen a woman in the attic window weeks after Clara's funeral. At the time, Alexander had dismissed it as nonsense, a grieving mind conjuring phantoms. Now, he wondered if there was truth behind her words. And then he saw it. A small wooden box tucked beneath a pile of blankets in the corner. It looked unassuming, almost ordinary, but something about it called to him. He knelt and pulled it free, brushing off a layer of grime to reveal intricate carvings etched into the lid, a violin, surrounded by stars. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside lay a single cassette tape, labeled simply in Clara's neat handwriting. For Alex, when you're ready. Tears blurred his vision as he held the tape, the weight of her presence overwhelming. She'd left this for him, for this moment. How could she have known? Or maybe she hadn't. Maybe she'd simply hoped. He found an old tape player buried among the boxes and plugged it in, fumbling with trembling fingers to load the tape. The mechanism clicked, whirred, and then her voice filled the room, soft and steady, as if she were sitting right beside him. Alex, my love, if you're hearing this, then I've failed. I'm sorry for what I've done, for the lies, the secrets, the pain I've caused you. Please believe me when I say I did it all to protect our children, both of them. Her voice cracked slightly, and he could hear the strain in her words, the effort it took to stay composed. Ella. Our sweet Ella. She was born with a heart defect, Alex. A severe one. Without immediate surgery, she wouldn't survive. But the hospital protocols, the legal delays, they were too slow. And your family. She paused, her tone hardening briefly. They would have fought me every step of the way. Custody battles, court orders, doctors chosen for prestige over care. I couldn't risk losing her. Not after everything we'd already lost. Alexander closed his eyes, his chest tightening. He remembered the arguments with his father, the constant interference from his family whenever medical decisions arose. They'd never understood how much Clara hated their control, how suffocating it felt. He should have protected her from them, should have shielded her. So, I made a choice, Clara continued, her voice breaking again. With Janice's help, I faked our deaths. Samuel's body became mine, buried under layers of secrecy no one dared question. And Ella. I entrusted her to someone I knew would keep her safe, someone who could disappear without a trace, someone strong enough to fight for her life. A tear slipped down Alexander's cheek as he listened, his heart aching with every word. She'd sacrificed herself. For their daughter. For Ella. I didn't plan to leave you, Alex. I wanted to come back, to explain, to rebuild. But I didn't survive long enough. My body gave out, and Janice did what she could to cover for me. By the time you hear this, I'll be gone. Truly gone." Her voice softened, trembling with emotion. "Please forgive me. Forgive me for lying, for leaving you alone. But most of all, forgive me for asking you to find her. Ella needs you now. She needs her father. And Micah, he's part of this too. Trust him, Alex. He's stronger than he seems." The recording ended abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. Alexander sat motionless, the tape player still clutched in his hands. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of Clara's final days. She hadn't abandoned him. She'd fought until her last breath to ensure Ella's survival. Even knowing she might never see them again, she'd chosen hope over despair. Micah, Ella, Clara's guardian angels, bound together by fate and fear, together, they formed a fragile chain leading back to the child he thought lost forever. Alexander wiped his tears, resolve hardening within him. Clara had trusted him to finish what she started, to bring Ella home. And he wouldn't let her down. Not now. Not ever. He rose to his feet, tucking the tape safely into his pocket. The attic seemed less oppressive now, its shadows softened by the knowledge that Clara's spirit lingered here, watching over them. As he descended the stairs, he whispered a promise into the empty air. "I'll find her, Clara, I swear it." The drive to Miss Thelma's home felt endless, the winding roads leading Alexander further from the familiar comforts of his world and deeper into uncertainty. The landscape shifted as he traveled. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests, their skeletal trees clawing at a gray sky. It was a place forgotten by time, where silence reigned and secrets festered. When he finally arrived, the house before him seemed as ancient as the woman who lived there. Its weathered wooden siding sagged under years of neglect, paint peeling like sunburnt skin. A faded swing creaked on the porch, swaying slightly in the cold wind. Despite its dilapidation, there was an air of warmth about it, a sense that life had once thrived within these walls. Alexander stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against gravel. He hesitated for a moment, steeling himself before climbing the rickety steps to knock on the door. After a long pause, it opened slowly, revealing a frail figure wrapped in layers of woolen shawls. Miss Thelma's face was lined with age, her eyes clouded but sharp, piercing through him with unsettling clarity. "You must be Mr. Porter," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "I wondered if you'd ever find your way here." Her words sent a chill through him. She knew why he'd come. Without waiting for a response, she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old books, much like Dr. Hargrove's cottage. Photographs covered nearly every surface, children of all ages smiling brightly, some clutching toys, others holding hands with Miss Thelma herself. Each photo told a story of lives touched, nurtured, and eventually let go. "Clara spoke highly of you," Alexander began cautiously, choosing his words carefully. "She trusted you with something very precious." Miss Thelma nodded, lowering herself into a worn armchair near the fireplace. Her movements were slow but deliberate, each one carrying the weight of someone who'd lived too many lifetimes. "Yes, she did. 2 precious souls, actually. A baby girl and a little boy." Her gaze softened as she added, "Micah." Alexander's breath hitched. So this was where Clara had left them. This quiet, unassuming woman had been their guardian when the world outside grew too dangerous. "What happened to them?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain composed. "Where is Ella now?" Miss Thelma sighed deeply, her fingers tracing the edge of a quilt draped over her lap. Clara brought them to me shortly after, well, after everything fell apart. She told me they needed a safe haven, somewhere no one would think to look, and I promised her I'd keep them hidden no matter what. But you couldn't. Alexander pressed gently, leaning forward. Something changed. She nodded sadly. It wasn't safe for them here, not anymore. People started asking questions, poking around. I didn't know who to trust. So I did what Clara instructed. I found new homes for them, separately, to protect them both. Alexander's heart sank. Separated again, just like Samuel and Ella. Just like Micah and Ella. The pattern was cruelly repetitive, each fracture designed to shield them from harm, but at what cost? Micah ran away, he explained softly. He found his way back to me. But Ella, where is she? Miss Thelma reached into a small wooden box on the table beside her, pulling out a delicate silver bracelet. Engraved on its surface were 3 initials, EGP Ella Grace Porter. Alexander's throat tightened as he took it from her, running his thumb over the cool metal. She was adopted, Miss Thelma said quietly, through an agency in the city, very discreet, very private. They assured me she'd be safe, that her new family wouldn't ask questions, but I never heard from her again, or from them. Do you have the name of the agency? Alexander asked, his voice strained but resolute. Miss Thelma hesitated, her cloudy eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded and scribbled a name on a scrap of paper, handing it to him. Hopeful Beginnings, Adoption Agency. I hope you find her, she whispered, her voice breaking. She deserves to know where she came from, who she is. Alexander stood, clutching the bracelet and the slip of paper tightly in his hand. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to reassure her, but words failed him. Instead, he simply nodded, gratitude heavy in his gaze. As he turned to leave, Miss Thelma called after him. Be careful, Mr. Porter. Whoever tried to take Ella once might still be looking for her. The warning lingered in the air long after he stepped outside, the weight of it settling heavily on his shoulders. The pieces were coming together now, forming a clearer picture of the danger lurking in the shadows. Clara hadn't just feared interference from his controlling family, she'd known something darker was at play. Back in his car, Alexander stared at the bracelet, the initials gleaming faintly in the fading light. Ella was alive, somewhere, and he would move heaven and earth to bring her home. For Clara, for Micah, for himself. And most of all, for Ella. The drive to rural Vermont was long and quiet, the kind of solitude that forced Alexander inward. He replayed every detail in his mind, the bracelet, the name of the adoption agency, the address they'd reluctantly provided after hours of persuasion. Each clue had led him closer to this moment, to her. Ella, 15 years old now, thriving despite the odds stacked against her. The thought filled him with a mix of awe and grief. How could he possibly explain who he was, what she meant to him? He wasn't ready, not truly, but time had run out. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, to reach her before anyone else could. When he arrived in the small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it felt like stepping into another world. Quaint farmhouses dotted the landscape, smoke curling lazily from chimneys into the crisp autumn air. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He parked on a dirt road overlooking a modest white farmhouse surrounded by golden fields. There she was, Ella, standing on the porch, her dark hair catching the sunlight as she tuned a violin. She looked so much like Clara it took his breath away. Same smile, same grace. And when she began to play, the melody carried across the distance, weaving through the trees and wrapping around his heart like an embrace. It was Clara's song, the one she used to sing while playing late at night, the one Micah remembered from his dreams. Alexander's knees nearly buckled under the weight of emotion. This was his daughter, his and Clara's, alive, whole. But then movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the house, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding yet unsettling. Richard Porter, Alexander's estranged older brother. For a moment, Alexander froze, disbelief crashing over him like a tidal wave. Richard hadn't been part of his life in over 2 decades. Not since their bitter falling out over family control and inheritance. Their father had groomed Richard to take over the family empire, leaving Alexander to carve out his own path. Yet, here he was, standing beside Ella, speaking to her with an ease that suggested familiarity. Alexander's pulse quickened, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Why was Richard here? Had he known about Ella all along? Was this why Clara feared custody battles? Because Richard would have fought tooth and nail to claim her? Ella laughed at something Richard said, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. Alexander's chest tightened. Whatever connection Richard had forged with her, it was real and dangerous. If Richard discovered Ella's true identity, if he realized she was Alexander's child, there was no telling what he might do. Alexander stayed hidden behind the wheel of his car, torn between rushing forward and retreating altogether. He couldn't risk exposing himself. Not yet. Not until he understood Richard's role in this twisted web. As dusk settled over the countryside, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Alexander watched them together. Richard handed Ella a jacket, saying something too soft for Alexander to hear. She nodded, slipping it on before following him back inside the house. The door closed behind them, cutting off the music mid-note. Alexander exhaled shakily, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He'd imagined finding Ella alone, introducing himself cautiously, earning her trust step by step. Instead, he faced an obstacle more daunting than any he'd anticipated. His own blood. Richard's involvement changed everything. If he suspected Ella's lineage, or worse, if he already knew, he wouldn't let her go without a fight. The same ruthless ambition that drove him to seize control of the family business would make him see Ella as leverage, a pawn in whatever game he was playing. Alexander leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as memories flooded back. Arguments shouted across boardroom tables, accusations hurled in heated moments, doors slamming shut both literally and metaphorically. Richard had always been calculating, manipulative. But even he wouldn't stoop to using a child. Would he? A cold realization settled over Alexander. Of course he would. Richard thrived on power, on control, and if Ella represented a threat or an opportunity, he wouldn't hesitate to exploit it. For now, though, Alexander needed information. He couldn't confront Richard directly, not without understanding his motives. For all he knew, Richard's presence here was coincidental. A chance meeting or business transaction unrelated to Ella. But deep down, Alexander doubted it. Too many threads connected them. Clara's fear of the family, Miss Thelma's warning, and now this. He started the car, pulling away slowly so as not to draw attention. As he drove, his mind raced, piecing together strategies and contingencies. One thing was certain. He couldn't wait any longer. Every second Richard spent near Ella was a risk too great to ignore. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he would approach her. With or without answers about Richard's intentions, he owed it to Clara, and to himself, to reclaim the daughter stolen from him. Because Ella wasn't just a survivor. She was a reminder of love, of hope, of everything worth fighting for. And Alexander would fight. The confrontation took place in the shadowed corners of the White House, where secrets seemed to breathe alongside the dust motes drifting through slanted beams of light. Alexander had called Richard there, demanding answers under the weight of everything that had come to light. The air was thick with unspoken truths, each brother standing on opposite sides of a chasm carved by years of mistrust and pain. "You," Alexander began, his voice low but trembling with barely contained fury. "You orchestrated all of this? The deaths, the lies, Ella's adoption, Micah being left behind?" Richard didn't flinch. His expression remained steady, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of guilt, or perhaps regret. He nodded slowly, meeting Alexander's gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he admitted, his tone calm but heavy. "Every last detail." Alexander clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out physically instead of verbally. "Why?" he demanded, his voice rising now. "Why would you do something so monstrous, so cruel?" "Because I thought it was the only way to keep her safe," Richard shot back, his composure cracking slightly. For the first time, vulnerability surfaced in his features. "Clara came to me when she realized how dire things were, how dangerous they could become for Ella if anyone found out about her condition. She trusted me, Alex. Trusted me more than she trusted you." The word stung like a slap, but Alexander forced himself to listen, to hear what Richard was saying beneath the harshness. "She knew your grief would destroy you," Richard continued, his voice softer now. "That losing Samuel broke something inside you, and she feared your family, their influence, their greed, would tear Ella away from you, from both of us. So we made a choice. Together." Alexander shook his head, disbelief warring with anger. "You let me believe she was dead. You let me bury my wife and son alone. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" "I know exactly what it did to you," Richard replied sharply, his own emotions bubbling to the surface. "I watched you fall apart. Watched you drink yourself into oblivion while I carried the weight of Clara's plan on my shoulders. But I also kept Ella alive, kept her safe. Isn't that worth something?" For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them stretched taut, broken only by the faint creak of floorboards settling in the old house. Alexander sank into a chair, his body sagging under the enormity of what he'd just learned. Everything he'd believed about the past decade. All the grief, the guilt, the loneliness. It had been built on a foundation of lies. Lies meant to protect him. Lies meant to save his daughter. And yet, none of it erased the truth. Richard had done what Alexander couldn't. He had shielded Ella from harm, raised her in secret, sacrificed his own freedom to ensure her survival. Finally, Alexander looked up at his brother, tears brimming in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why wait until now?" "Because I wasn't sure you were ready," Richard admitted quietly. "Grief changes people, Alex. It blinds them. I needed to be certain you wouldn't make another mistake, one that could cost Ella her life." Alexander exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. The bitterness still lingered, sharp and biting. But beneath it was something else. Understanding. Forgiveness. Slowly, painfully, he nodded. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything. for doubting you, for letting Clara down." Richard hesitated, then stepped forward, placing a tentative hand on Alexander's shoulder. "We both failed her in our own ways," he said softly. "But maybe we can make it right. Together." Later that evening, the White House was alive with sound for the first time in years. Ella sat in the music room, cradling Clara's violin as though it were an extension of herself. Her fingers danced across the strings, coaxing melodies that echoed through the halls like whispers of redemption. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of awe and heartache. Micah appeared beside him, his presence quiet but unwavering. They exchanged a glance, wordless but full of meaning. Then, stepping forward, Micah cleared his throat softly. "Ella," he said, his voice hesitant but warm. She turned, startled, her bow pausing mid-stroke. Recognition dawned slowly, widening her dark eyes. "Micah," she breathed, her voice barely audible. He nodded, smiling tentatively. "It's me." Tears welled in her eyes as she set the violin aside and rose to her feet. In 2 quick strides, she crossed the room and threw her arms around him, holding him tightly as though afraid he might vanish again. Micah hugged her back, his own tears spilling freely. "You remember me," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "Of course I do," she whispered. "How could I forget?" Alexander stepped back, giving them space. As he watched the reunion unfold, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. A bittersweet acknowledgement that some wounds could never fully heal, but others could mend in unexpected ways. When Ella finally pulled away from Micah, she turned to Alexander, studying him with curiosity and caution. "You're my father," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Aren't you?" He nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "Yes," he replied simply. "I am." She hesitated, then approached him cautiously, her gaze searching his face for answers to questions she hadn't yet asked. When she reached out to take his hand, he squeezed it gently, offering her the same reassurance he wished he'd given Clara all those years ago. "I'm so sorry," he told her, his voice trembling, "for everything you've been through, for not being there when you needed me." Ella shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're here now," she said softly. "That's what matters." They stayed like that for a long moment, the 3 of them bound together by loss, love, and hope. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. Inside, laughter returned to the White House, not the carefree kind of childhood innocence, but the kind born of resilience and healing. As Ella picked up the violin again and began to play, her notes filled the air with a melody that felt achingly familiar. It was Clara's song, woven with threads of joy and sorrow, memory and possibility, and for the first time in years, Alexander allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find happiness here after all.